So today we're diving into a really challenging argument, and it comes from Tony C. Antoniou's book, Conflict and War in the Eastern Mediterranean, Ukraine, and Beyond. And what it does is it forces us to face this absolutely brutal question that sits right at the heart of how nations deal with each other. Just think about that for a second. Seriously, should a country that's not as strong just give up, just submit to a more powerful one to avoid being completely wiped off the map? It's a horrible choice to even consider, but it's a question that has shaped our history and is still defining conflicts right now. Now, there is a major school of thought out there, a very influential one, that would look at that question and answer with a cold, pragmatic yes. But the author we're looking at today, Tony Antoniou, he argues this idea isn't just cynical, he calls it dangerous. In his words, it's a worldview that defends bullies and excuses aggression. So let's really get into his critique.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly is this worldview we're talking about? Well, the author really focuses his critique on a concept called realpolitik.
The author lays it out like this. Realpolitik, or realism, is basically a worldview where power is everything, the only thing that truly matters. He explains that things like national strength and practical advantages always come first, way ahead of abstract ideas like, morality or international law. And in his view, the result is that weaker nations are constantly pressured to surrender their rights, their land, and even their sovereignty to their stronger neighbors.
And the author points out that this is not some newfangled critique. He highlights that even Hans Morgenthau, the person often called the father of modern realism, eventually started warning against pure power politics. Way back in 1978, Morgenthau himself said that such approaches could one day destroy humanity.
So who does the author see as the main architect of this worldview in our time? He points directly at the former U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. He argues that Kissinger's deep commitment to realpolitik led to policies that propped up dictatorships and, he claims, ultimately resulted in the deaths of millions. Okay, so that's the theory, but what does this mindset actually sound like up close in a real conversation? The author shares this personal story that really brings this abstract idea into sharp and kind of shocking focus.
The story comes from a meeting he had with a professor at New York University, who also happened to be a former Undersecretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. And according to the author, this individual was the living, breathing embodiment of the realpolitik mindset.
The author says the conversation kicked off with this incredibly condescending question from the professor. I hope you are not one of those who believe in international law. And he didn't just stop there. He apparently followed it up immediately with, I laugh at those people, basically dismissing anyone whose worldview wasn't based on pure, raw power.
And according to the author, the professor's view was just consistently dismissive. He reportedly called Greek leaders crybabies for looking for alliances, he mocked peace efforts as a waste of time, and he argued that Washington couldn't care less about smaller nations like Cyprus, all seen through this one lens of power.
But here's the thing. The author doesn't just find this view cynical, he argues it's factually wrong. It's just not an accurate way to see the world. So let's look at how he tries to set the record straight. So, on that claim that Washington couldn't even find Cyprus on a map, the author comes back with a direct rebuttal. He points out that actually, Congress cared enough to impose an arms embargo on Turkey, a NATO ally, over its invasion of Cyprus in 1974. And get this, a key figure pushing for that embargo was John Bradamus, who just so happened to be the president of the professor's own university. And what about that crybaby comment directed at Greek leaders? The author's counter is that, for decades, Greece has been actively defending its own sovereignty, using its own military to push back against Turkish incursions. From his perspective, seeking alliances isn't weakness, it's just smart diplomacy. And he drives this point home with a really powerful quote from 1964. With the Turkish attack on Cyprus looking imminent, the Greek prime minister didn't beg for help, he sent a stark warning to Washington. He said that if Turkey wants to start a war, to enter the madhouse, then Greece is ready to go right in with her. That hardly sounds like the action of a crybaby, does it? Next, the author broadens his critique. He argues that if you think foreign policy is just about military strength, you're missing huge pieces of the puzzle. It's also very much about money and domestic politics.
Remember, the professor claimed U.S. support for Israel was simple. It was because Israel was strong. Well, the author challenges that head-on. He argues that domestic politics and huge financial contributions from powerful lobby groups have played a much bigger role.
And as a pretty staggering modern example of this, the source points to a single donor contributing $100 million to a U.S. presidential campaign, allegedly with the expectation of shaping pro-Israel policies. Now, to explain how this kind of influence works, the author points to an academic idea called selectorate theory. It sounds a bit complicated, but the core idea is simple. Political leaders do what they need to do to stay in power. And that means keeping a small, essential group of supporters, their winning coalition, very happy. From that point of view, a $100 million donor isn't just a supporter, they're a key part of that coalition whose interests get top priority.
And this isn't just a recent thing. The author notes that if you go all the way back to 1948, historians generally agree that President Truman's support for Israel was driven by a mix of things: humanitarian concerns, domestic political pressure, not just some cold calculation of who had the bigger army.
All right, so let's bring this all together. In his final judgment, the author looks at what he sees as the real-world consequences of this realpolitik worldview, specifically for places like Cyprus and, more recently, Ukraine.
In the author's analysis, it's a straight line. The same logic from Kissinger that he argues meant the Greek Cypriots had no choice but to surrender to Turkey in 1974, well, that very same logic, he says, would demand that Ukraine submit to Russia's invasion today to avoid further destruction.
He even lays out what he calls Kissinger's Ukraine playbook, and it's a stark, four-step vision. 1. Go along with the invaders' excuses. 2. Ignore international agreements you've signed. 3. Put pressure on the victim to give in. And 4. Refuse to help and just stand by while the slaughter happens, all for the sake of quote-unquote stability.
So in the end, the author's argument is that this approach, this appeasement of aggressors, it simply doesn't bring peace. It just encourages more aggression down the road. And his whole critique really leaves us wrestling with this incredibly difficult and incredibly important question. Where do we draw the line between pragmatic diplomacy and outright submission?